The Battle of Timor occurred in Portuguese Timor and Dutch Timor during the Second World War. Japanese forces invaded the island on 20 February 1942 and were resisted by a small, under-equipped force of Allied military personnel, known as Sparrow Force, predominantly from Australia, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands East Indies. Following a brief but stout resistance, the Japanese succeeded in forcing the surrender of the bulk of the Allied force after 3 days of fighting. Although several hundred Australian commandos continued to wage an unconventional raiding campaign, they were resupplied by aircraft and vessels based mostly in Darwin, Australia, about 650 kilometers to the southeast, across the Timor Sea. During the subsequent fighting, the Japanese suffered heavy casualties, but they were eventually able to contain the Australians. The campaign lasted until the 10th of February 1943, when the final remaining Australians were evacuated, making them the last Allied land forces to leave Southeast Asia following the Japanese offensives of 1941–42. As a result, an entire Japanese division was tied up on Timor for more than 6 months, preventing its deployment elsewhere. Although Portugal was not a combatant, many East Timorese civilians and Portuguese European colonists fought with the Allies, or provided them with food, shelter and other assistance. Some Timorese continued a resistance campaign following the Australian withdrawal. For this, they paid a heavy price, and tens of thousands of Timorese civilians died as a result of the Japanese occupation, which lasted until the end of the war in 1945. Background: by late 1941, the island of Timor was divided politically between two colonial powers, the Portuguese in the east with a capital at Dili, and the Dutch in the west with an administrative centre at Kupang. A Portuguese enclave at Ocusi was also within the Dutch area. The Dutch defence included a force of 500 troops centred on Kupang, while the Portuguese force at Dili numbered just 150. In February, the Australian and Dutch governments had agreed that in the event Japan entered the Second World War on the Axis side, Australia would provide aircraft and troops to reinforce Dutch Timor. Portugal, under pressure from Japan, maintained its neutrality. As such, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a small Australian force, known as Sparrow Force, arrived at Kupang on 12 December 1941. Meanwhile, two similar forces, known as Gull Force and Lark Force, were sent by the Australians to reinforce Ambon and Rabaul. Sparrow Force was initially commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Leggett, and included the 240th Battalion, a commando unit, the 2nd Independent Company, under Major Alexander Spence, and a battery of coastal artillery. There were in total around 1,400 men. The force reinforced Royal Netherlands East Indies Army troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Nico van Straten, including the Timor and Dependencies Garrison Battalion, a company from the 8th Infantry Battalion, a reserve infantry company, a machine gun platoon from the 13th Infantry Battalion, and an artillery battery. Air support consisted of 12 Lockheed Hudson light bombers of No. 2 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Sparrow Force was initially deployed around Kupang, and the strategic airfield of Penfua in the southwest corner of the island, although other units were based at Klapalima, USAPA Besar and Babao, while a supply base was also established further east at Champlong. Up to this point, the government of Portugal had declined to cooperate with the Allies, relying on its claim of neutrality and plans to send an 800-strong force from Mozambique to defend the territory in the event of any Japanese invasion. However, this refusal left the Allied flank severely exposed, and a 400-man combined Dutch-Australian force subsequently occupied Portuguese Timor on 17 December. In response, the Portuguese Prime Minister, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, protested to the Allied governments, while the governor of Portuguese Timor declared himself a prisoner in order to preserve the appearance of neutrality. No resistance was offered by the small Portuguese garrison, however, and the local authorities tacitly cooperated, while the population itself generally welcomed the Allied force. Most of the Dutch troops and the whole of the Second Independent Company were subsequently transferred to Portuguese Timor and distributed in small detachments around the territory. The Portuguese and the British governments reached an agreement that established the withdrawal of the Allied forces from Portuguese Timor, in exchange for the sending, by Portugal, of a military force to replace them. The Portuguese force sailed from Lourenço Marques, Mozambique, heading for Timor on 28 January 1942, but the Japanese invasion occurred before they could arrive. Prelude. In January 1942, the Allied forces on Timor became a key link in the so-called Malay Barrier, defended by the short-lived American-British-Dutch-Australian command under the overall command of General Sir Archibald Wavell. Additional Australian support staff arrived at Kupang on 12 February, including Brigadier William Veal, who had been made the Allied commanding officer on Timor. By this time, many members of Sparrow Force, most of whom were unused to tropical conditions, were suffering from malaria and other illnesses. The airfield at Penfew in Dutch Timor also became a key air link between Australia and American forces fighting in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur. Penfew came under attack from Japanese aircraft on 26 and 30 January 1942. However, the raids were hampered by the British anti-aircraft gunners and, to a lesser degree, by P-40 fighters of the 33rd Pursuit Squadron, United States Army Air Forces, 11 of which were based in Darwin. Later, another 500 Dutch troops and the British 79th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery arrived to reinforce Timor, while an additional Australian-American force was scheduled to arrive in February. Meanwhile, Rabaul fell to the Japanese on 23 January, followed by Ambon on 3 February, and both Gulf Force and Lark Force were destroyed. Later, on 16 February, an Allied convoy carrying reinforcements and supplies to Kupang, escorted by the heavy cruiser US Houston, the destroyer US Perry, and the sloops HMAS Swan and Beauregard, came under intense Japanese air attack and was forced to return to Darwin without landing. The reinforcements had included an Australian Pioneer Battalion, the 4th Pioneer Battalion, and the 49th American Artillery Battalion. Sparrow Force could not be reinforced further, and as the Japanese moved to complete their envelopment of the Netherlands East Indies, Timor was seemingly the next logical target. Battle. Japanese invasion of Portuguese Timor. 1920 February 1942. On the night of 19/20 February, 1,500 troops from the Imperial Japanese Army's 228th Regimental Group, 38th Division, 16 Army, under the command of Colonel Sadashi Chidio, began landing in Dili. Initially, the Japanese ships were mistaken for vessels carrying Portuguese reinforcements, and the Allies were caught by surprise. Nevertheless, they were well prepared, and the garrison began an orderly withdrawal, covered by the 18-strong Australian Commando No. 2 section stationed at the airfield. According to Australian accounts, the commandos killed an estimated 200 Japanese in the first hours of the battle, the Japanese army recorded its casualties as only 7 men, but native accounts of the landings support the Australian claims. Another group of Australian commandos, No. 7 section, was less fortunate, driving into a Japanese roadblock by chance, despite surrendering. According to military historian Brad Minera, all but 1 were massacred by the Japanese. Outnumbered, the surviving Australians withdrew to the south and to the east, into the mountainous interior. Van Straten and 200 Dutch East Indies troops headed southwest toward the border. On the same night, Allied forces in Dutch Timor also came under extremely intense air attacks, which had already caused the small RAF force to be withdrawn to Australia. The bombing was followed up by the landing of the main body of the 228th Regimental Group, 2 battalions totaling around 4,000 men, on the undefended southwest side of the island, at the Paha River. 5 Type 94 tankettes were landed to support their Japanese infantry, and the force advanced north, cutting off the Dutch positions in the west and attacking the 240th Battalion positions at Penfua. A Japanese company thrust northeast to Usu, aiming to cut off the Allied retreat. In response, Sparrow Force HQ was immediately moved further east, towards Champlong. Leggett ordered the destruction of the airfield, but the Allied line of retreat towards Champlong had been cut off by the dropping of about 300 Japanese Marine paratroopers. For the 3rd Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, near Usu at 22 kilometers east of Kupang, Sparrow Force HQ moved further eastward, and Leggett's men launched a sustained and devastating assault on the paratroopers, culminating in a bayonet charge. By the morning of the 23rd of February, the 240th Battalion had killed all but 78 of the paratroopers, but had been engaged from the rear by the main Japanese force once again, with his soldiers running low on ammunition, exhausted, and carrying many men with serious wounds. Leggett accepted a Japanese invitation to surrender at Usu. The 240th Battalion had suffered 84 killed and 132 wounded in the fighting, while more than twice that number would die as prisoners of war during the next 2.5 years. Veal and the Sparrow Force HQ force, including about 290 Australian and Dutch troops, continued eastward across the border, to link up with the Two Halves Independent Company. Australian commandos continued to resist. August 1942. By the end of February, the Japanese controlled most of Dutch Timor and the area around Dili in the northeast. However, the Australians remained in the south and east of the island. The 2nd Independent Company was specially trained for commando-style stay-behind operations, and it had its own engineers and signallers. Although it lacked heavy weapons and vehicles, the commandos were hidden throughout the mountains of Portuguese Timor, and they commenced raids against the Japanese, assisted by Timorese guides, native carriers and mountain ponies. Although Portuguese officials, under Governor Manuel de Abreu Ferreira de Carvalho, remained officially neutral and in charge of civil affairs, both the Portuguese and the indigenous East Timorese were usually sympathetic to the Allies, who were able to use the local telephone system to communicate among themselves and gather intelligence on Japanese movements. However, the Allies initially did not have functioning radio equipment and were unable to contact Australia to inform them of the continued resistance. DOI sent the Australian Honorary Consul, David Ross, also the local Qantas agent, to find the commandos and pass on a demand to surrender. Spence responded, "Surrender. Surrender be fucked." Ross gave the commandos information on the disposition of Japanese forces and also provided a note in Portuguese, stating that anyone supplying them would be later reimbursed by the Australian government. In early March, Veal and Van Stratton's forces linked up with the 2nd Company. A replacement radio, nicknamed Winnie the War Winner, was cobbled together and contact was made with Darwin. By May, Australian aircraft were dropping supplies to the commandos and their allies. The Japanese High Command sent a highly regarded veteran of the Malayan Campaign and the Battle of Singapore, a major known as the Tiger of Singapore, to Timor. On the 22nd of May, the Tiger, mounted on a white horse, led a Japanese force towards Remexia. An Australian patrol, with Portuguese and Timorese assistance, staged an ambush and killed 4 or 5 of the Japanese soldiers. During a second ambush, an Australian sniper shot and killed the Tiger. Another 24 Japanese soldiers were also killed, and the force retreated to Dili. On the 24th of May, Veal and Van Stratton were evacuated from the southeast coast by RAF Catalina, and Spence was appointed commanding officer, after being promoted to lieutenant colonel. On the 27th of May, Royal Australian Navy launches successfully completed the first supply and evacuation missions to Timor. In June, General Douglas MacArthur, now the Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific area, was advised by General Thomas Blamey, Allied Land Force Commander, that a full-scale Allied offensive in Timor would require a major amphibious assault, including at least 1 infantry division. Because of this requirement and the overall Allied strategy of recapturing areas to the east in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Blamey recommended that the campaign in Timor should be sustained for as long as possible, but not expanded. This suggestion was ultimately adopted. Relations between Ferreira de Carvalho and the Japanese deteriorated. His telegraph link with the Portuguese government in Lisbon was cut. In June 1942, a Japanese official complained that the governor had rejected Japanese demands to punish Portuguese officials and Timorese and civilians who had assisted the invading army. On the 24th of June, the Japanese formally complained to Lisbon, but did not take any action against Ferreira de Carvalho. Meanwhile, DOI once again sent Ross with a message complimenting Sparrow Force on its campaign so far, and again asking that it surrender. The Japanese commander drew parallel with the efforts of Afrikaner commandos of the Second Boer War and said that he realized it would take a force 10 times that of the Allies to win. Nevertheless, DOI said he was receiving reinforcements, and would eventually assemble the necessary units. This time Ross did not return to Dili, and he was evacuated to Australia on the 16th of July. In August, the Japanese 48th Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Uetsu Tsuchihashi, began arriving from the Philippines and garrisoned Kupang, Dili and Malacca, relieving the Ito detachment. Tsuchihashi then launched a major counter-offensive in an attempt to push the Australians into a corner on the south coast of the island. Strong Japanese columns moved south, 2 from Dili and 1 from Manachita on the northeast coast. Another moved eastward from Dutch Timor to attack Dutch positions in the central south of the island. The offensive ended on the 19th of August when the main Japanese force was withdrawn to Rabaul, but not before they secured the central town of Maubis and the southern port of Beko. The Japanese were also recruiting significant numbers of Timorese civilians, who provided intelligence on Allied movements. Meanwhile, also in late August, a parallel conflict began when the Maubis rebelled against the Portuguese. During September, the main body of the Japanese 48th Division began arriving to take over the campaign. The Australians also sent reinforcements, in the form of the 450-strong 4th Independent Company, known as Lancer Force, which arrived on the 23rd of September. The destroyer HMAS Voyager ran aground at the southern port of Batano while landing the 4th, and had to be abandoned after it came under air attack. The ship's crew was safely evacuated by HMAS Kalgoorlie and Warrnambool on the 25th of September 1942, and the ship destroyed by demolition charges. On the 27th of September, the Japanese mounted a thrust from Dili towards the wreck of Voyager, but without any significant success. By October, the Japanese had succeeded in recruiting significant numbers of Timorese civilians, who suffered severe casualties when used in frontal assaults against the Allies. The Portuguese were also being pressured to assist the Japanese, and at least 26 Portuguese civilians were killed in the first 6 months of the occupation, including local officials and a Catholic priest. On the 1st of November, the Allied High Command approved the issuing of weapons to Portuguese officials, a policy which had previously been carried out on an informal basis. At around the same time, the Japanese ordered all Portuguese civilians to move to a neutral zone by the 15th of November. Those who failed to comply were to be considered accomplices of the Allies. This succeeded only in encouraging the Portuguese to cooperate with the Allies, whom they lobbied to evacuate some 300 women and children. Spence was evacuated to Australia on the 11th of November, and the 2nd Commander, Major Bernard Callanan, was appointed Allied Commander in Timor. On the night of the 30th of November, the 1st of December, the Royal Australian Navy mounted a major operation to land fresh Dutch troops at Batano, while evacuating 190 Dutch soldiers and 150 Portuguese civilians. The launch HMAS Uru was used to ferry the passengers between the shore and 2 corvettes, HMAS Armidale and Castlemaine. However, Armidale, carrying the Dutch reinforcements, was sunk by Japanese aircraft and almost all of those on board were lost. Also during November, the Australian Army's Public Relations Branch arranged to send the Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker Damien and a war correspondent named Bill Marion to Timor. Pera's film, Men of Timor, was later greeted with enthusiasm by audiences in Allied countries. By the end of 1942, the chances of the Allies retaking Timor were remote, as there were now 12,000 Japanese troops on the island and the commandos were coming into increasing contact with the enemy. The Australian Chiefs of Staff estimated that it would take at least 3 Allied divisions, with strong air and naval support, to recapture the island. Indeed, as the Japanese efforts to wear down the Australians and to separate them from the native support became more effective, the commandos had found their operations becoming increasingly untenable. Likewise, with the Australian Army fighting a number of costly battles against the Japanese beachheads around Buna in New Guinea, there were currently insufficient resources to continue operations in Timor. As such, from early December, Australian operations on Timor would be progressively wound down. On 11–12 December, the remainder of the original Sparrow Force, except for a few officers, was evacuated with Portuguese civilians by the Dutch destroyer HNLMS Turquidus. Meanwhile, in the first week of January, the decision was made to withdraw Lancer Force. On the night of 9–10 January 1943, the bulk of the 2, 4th and 50 Portuguese were evacuated by the destroyer HMAS Aronta, A small intelligence team known as S-Force was left behind, but its presence was soon detected by the Japanese. Aided by foul-boats, the remnants of Lancer Force, S-Force made its way to the eastern tip of Timor, where the Australian-British said Special Unit was also operating. They were evacuated by the American submarine Gudgeon on 10 February. 40 Australian commandos were killed during this phase of the fighting, while 1,500 Japanese were believed to have died. Aftermath. Overall, while the campaign on Timor had little strategic value, the Australian commandos had prevented an entire Japanese division from being used in the earlier phases of the New Guinea campaign, while at the same time inflicting a disproportionate level of casualties on them. In contrast to those in Java and Bonaire, Australian operations in Timor had been far more successful, even if it was also largely a token effort in the face of overwhelming Japanese strength. Likewise, they had proved that in favorable circumstances, unconventional operations could be both versatile and more economic than conventional operations, for which the resources were not available to the Allies at the time. Most civilian deaths were caused by Japanese reprisals against the civilian population. The civilian death toll is estimated at 40,000 to 70,000. Ultimately, Japanese forces remained in control of Timor until the surrender in September 1945. Following the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, on 5 September 1945, the Japanese commanding officer met Portuguese Governor Manuel de Abreu Ferreira de Carvalho, effectively returning power to him and placing the Japanese forces under Portuguese authority. On the 11th of September, the Australian Timor Force arrived in Kupang Harbour and accepted the surrender of all Japanese forces on Timor from the senior Japanese officer on Timor, Colonel Ida Tatsuichi of the 4th Tank Regiment. The commander of the Timor Force, Brigadier Louis Dyke, of senior diplomat W.D. Forsyth, and as many ships as possible, were dispatched to Dili. Arriving on the 23rd of September, ceremonies were then held with Australians, Portuguese and other local residents. Australian troops then supervised the disposal of arms by Japanese work parties before returning to West Timor for the surrender of the commander of the 48th Division, Lieutenant General Yamada Kunitaro. On the 27th of September, a Portuguese naval and military force of more than 2,000 troops arrived to an impressive ceremony of welcome by the Timorese people. These troops included 3 engineering companies along with substantial supplies of food and construction materials for the reconstruction of Timor.